Hi there and welcome back. Continuing our theme of looking at what might have happened in our past that impacts on our well-being, our self-esteem and our self-confidence in adulthood, and particularly those things that impact on our ability to run a business or to lead an organisation, to make decisions that lead to the growth of our business or organisation. It can be really important to get a clear understanding of what sort of things that happened in the past can impact on the self-esteem and confidence. So today we are going to be looking at emotional neglect and physical neglect. So I'm going to begin with a bit of a disclaimer, I guess, because of questions that have been asked of me by clients, prospective clients, attendees of my masterclasses and webinars. And sometimes people can be reluctant to look into their past and to see that there were areas of neglect. But if we start off by saying that every single one of us has experienced neglect to some degree. When we are born, we have the need for our carers, for our parents usually, to take care of us 24/7, to listen out for our smallest need, to attend to those needs as quickly as possible. But of course, in the real world, that's not possible. We can't have our parents' attention, our carers' attention 24/7, 365 days a year. Those adults in our life, even with good intentions, they need to sleep. They need to eat. They maybe need to go off to work. So by definition, each and every one of us, even with well-intentioned, well-functioning parents or carers, we still have gaps. But in the majority of cases, those gaps are made up for in other ways, and so they're mitigated, if you like, and don't leave long-lasting negative imprints on our well-being, on our behaviour, on our self-worth and our sense of having a place in the world. But there are cases where there is no mitigation, where there is no way that the gaps of neglect are made up for in other ways. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And I'll be drilling down into what exactly emotional neglect can look like, and doing the same for physical neglect, and then giving you some pointers, some signposting to ideas that you can start to put into practice to revert the negative effects of any neglect that you may have experienced in your life. All forms of neglect are on some sort of continuum, so there are varying degrees, both in intensity and frequency, that will have an impact on the consequences of any neglect that we experienced. I think it's also important to point out that neglect may not be deliberate. So when I have clients who are almost holding back because they don't want to be disloyal to their parents, they still need to acknowledge that there were areas of neglect that have had negative consequences on their behaviour, on their habits in adulthood, and their ability to run their business, to lead a team, or to feel fulfilled and worthy. Let's look then at emotional neglect. And emotional neglect is any sort of lack or any sort of behaviour that leads to us feeling invalidated or belittled or unimportant or dismissed. And as I said before, sometimes this isn't deliberate, it's not malicious, but it's something that may happen to us, and we have to acknowledge that that happened first of all, and then we can start to repair any damages and use some reparenting techniques on ourselves in order to begin the healing process. So it's important to know that we are not blaming here. This isn't about making other people feel responsible. Maybe there were people who are responsible for your feelings of neglect, your experiences of neglect, and maybe it was deliberate, maybe not. But that's not the purpose of what we're doing today, to lay blame. It is to become aware of what happened, what may have happened for you, and then look at healing those wounds that have resulted from that experience. Let's look at some examples of what emotional neglect could look like in a practical way. Imagine a child running home from school. They got a good grade on a project, or they achieved something significant and were praised at school, and they come running into the home and they're all excited with their news, but either the parents are too busy, or the parents aren't there, or the parents just don't want to hear and are more concerned with what they are doing, or maybe tending to another younger sibling, or tending to some other chore. So immediately that child is going to feel deflated, is going to feel that their achievement that initially buoyed them up actually wasn't important at all, and they are going to feel that they themselves are not important. A teenager may struggle with feelings of anxiety or low mood. Maybe they try to talk to the parent or carer about what's going on for them, but their feelings, their experiences are dismissed, are not taken seriously, and this can reinforce that feeling of isolation that teenager was already experiencing. Sometimes this sort of attitude from the parent or carer may be because they themselves are fearful of mental health issues. Maybe it's because they just don't know where to start in dealing with it. They feel overwhelmed, but it could be for other reasons. But whatever those reasons, the result is that teenager who's already struggling and needs help has tried to reach out and has just been dismissed, told to go away, or that it will pass, or to sort it out themselves. So that is emotional neglect also. There can be a complete or partial absence of physical touch and comforting. So no hugs, no snuggling up, no hand holding even. I have a client who described how her mother refused to hold her hand even when crossing the road, would say that it hurt her hand, so the child could just hold her sleeve. So there was no physical contact between that daughter and her mother, and that can reinforce the idea that a child isn't worthy or isn't wanted, doesn't feel loved. And physical touch is so important to us as humans, to have that connection, to feel that we are bonded, that we are connected to people, and that we belong in a tribe, in this case in the family. So really important when that physical touch is absent. We may have a child who is struggling to express what is going on for themselves. They may not be particularly adept at expressing themselves verbally. So if the parent or carer doesn't pay attention to the child and doesn't pick up on non-verbal cues and other behaviours that the child is acting out, then that is also a neglect of their needs, and once more reinforces that isolation and that idea that the child is not worthy, is not important. The other type of neglect is physical neglect, and this can imply a lack of food, shelter, clothing and medical care. Physical neglect has an impact on our well-being and our self-esteem, our self-confidence, our ability to function in adulthood, just as much as emotional neglect. So let's look at some examples of what physical neglect might look like. Failing to provide a child with adequate, nutritious food is a form of physical neglect, and as well as the physical consequences that we see involving stunted growth and other indications of failure to thrive in childhood, it reinforces the idea that we are not worth nourishing and can lead to eating disorders amongst many other issues later in life. And this is one of the instances where there may not be a deliberate attempt to neglect the child, but it could be poverty that is driving the parent or the carer to buy the cheaper types of food, which generally speaking are not the most nutritious. So not deliberate neglect in many cases, although of course it does happen in some where food is restricted in some way, and we have sadly instances where there were locks on the fridge or on the cupboards to prevent the children in the household accessing food themselves. So as well as malnutrition from having poor quality food, there may have also been malnutrition through not enough food. Neglect in terms of adequate clothing can be an issue which is also potentially related to poverty and low income, but in other cases it is willful neglect, if you like. But this can look like many different things. A child may be forced to wear clothes that are ill-fitting, shoes that are too tight or too big, may not have adequate clothing for the weather conditions. They may not have a coat to protect them in the cold and the rain. So again, this can be non-deliberate because the family is struggling financially, but also it can be a lack of interest and parents, carers who are choosing to spend the money on things for themselves rather than provide adequate clothing for their children. Poor personal hygiene is another example, and this can take on many different forms. It can be not providing the child with adequate cleaning or toiletries, should I say, adequate toothbrushes, toothpaste, that sort of thing. And for girls, when they're going into puberty, it may be not providing them with sanitary materials that they need, or not providing the education that they need whilst they're going through those experiences. So partly, in some cases, this can be related to poverty. In other cases, as for the clothing, this may be because there is a lack of interest, or that money that should have been going on hygiene products is being spent elsewhere. In some cases, children are not given access to the bath or the shower. They are not taught to keep themselves clean. They are not taught to change their underwear, change their clothing, and are not supplied with enough clean clothes in order to make sure they stay clean and dry. That lack of hygiene can extend to the home environment, which once more may be deliberate or may be a result of poverty of that particular family. But this can include stuff that has been in the news quite a lot recently, such as black mould growing inside the home, or structural defects in the home making it unsafe. This is one of the real basic rights of every human being, to have a safe dwelling. But this wasn't the case for many of my clients, and sadly it does still go on today. And the final example of physical neglect is lack of adequate medical care. So again, failure to pay attention to any injuries, minor or otherwise, or failure to act on any injuries that are sustained by a child, and then lack of basic medical or first aid equipment within the home, plasters, something to clean any wounds, anything to reduce temperatures in young children, which can quickly escalate into something much more serious, but can be easily nipped in the bud if we have a simple paracetamol product to hand, for example. For a child who of course grows up into becoming an adult, to have sustained any one of those forms of neglect, sometimes multiple forms of neglect, it has devastating consequences on their self-worth, their self-esteem, and their confidence once they reach adulthood. But there are things that you can start to do if this has affected you, or that you can help somebody else to do if you're watching this with interest because of an experience of somebody you are close to. And all of these things are a form of re-parenting, actually, and almost like plugging the gaps that were left by neglect in childhood. We can retrospectively fill those gaps. And this retrospective reparenting of ourselves starts from working with ourselves from the inside. So first of all, practicing self-compassion. Quite often this is really hard for people who have experienced neglect to do, because they are not used to people being kind and attentive to them, and they are not kind or attentive to themselves. So starting to practice self-compassion, even in a very small way, can start to fill those gaps as I described them. So this can take the form of just being patient with yourself, catching yourself as you call yourself names or beat yourself up about something you've forgotten to do or not done well enough, perhaps. Just notice the way you are talking to yourself and press pause. Remind yourself that you have been doing your best, and that if you're a bit tired today, if you haven't been able to do everything you wanted to do, that's okay. You've done your best. And just make a habit of catching that self-critical voice and making it more compassionate, more understanding. And imagine even that you are talking to yourself as a little child, and you are going to talk to your inner child in a kind, compassionate way. And this does have a really big impact on how we feel as adults if we have those imaginary conversations with ourselves as a young child. And we can start to rebuild that feeling of worthiness from the inside by just making simple changes, such as ensuring our self-talk is more compassionate. So that's my first suggestion to you. Secondly, give yourself the opportunity to reconnect with your emotions, because the chances are you have distanced yourself a little bit or a lot from what happened to you in the past and what is happening to you now. So you need to create a safe space within you for those emotions to come up and allow them to come up. There are no such things as negative emotions. Emotions are messages from our very core, and we need to release those messages and then see if we need to act on them. But first and foremost, creating a safe space where we can just allow emotions to come up, not in the first instance trying to do anything with them, but just saying it's okay. It's okay if I feel sad. It's okay if I feel angry. It's okay if I feel resentful. Anything at all that comes up is totally valid. And you may be able to do this whilst you are journaling. It doesn't have to be anything formal, but just getting a notebook and writing your thoughts down. They don't have to be coherent, they don't have to be in beautiful handwriting, but give yourself 5 minutes at a time and see what comes up, and then keep that book for yourself. Some people prefer to do that on their phone if they're more digitally inclined, and that's absolutely fine. For other people it could be doodling or colouring in. There are lots of mindful colouring books around these days, so get yourself a nice box of coloured crayons and one of these colouring books and just allow yourself to colour in, and again keep that space calm and safe and allow whatever comes up to come up. Thirdly, time to think about your boundaries. If you experienced neglect that has had an impact on you right through to adulthood, the chances are boundaries were blurred and roles were unclear, because those people who were supposed to be looking out for you, taking care of you, weren't doing that. Whether they deliberately neglected you or not, the resulting outcome is that you weren't taken care of, and it wasn't clear who was supposed to be doing what. So now is your opportunity to think about where those boundaries need to be and to feel your way through this renegotiating of boundaries. Give yourself plenty of time to start in a small way, maybe practicing just creating a buffer when somebody asks you to do something. For example, if your tendency has been to address and attend to everybody else's needs as soon as they ask and ignore your own because they've always been neglected, now is the time to just start pausing. And if you are asked to do something, for example, just say, I'll get back to you. I just need to check something, or I need to check my diary. And then give yourself that time and space and think, really, do I want to do this thing? Really, do I have the time to do that? And give myself a bit of a break as well. So saying no and setting boundaries can take a long time to get into the habit of, but you can do it if you start in baby steps. So that first step would be just giving yourself some time and space before giving an answer, and start building up from there. Building supportive connections is my next tip for you, and that is really important. Where neglect has taken place, there is a real lack of feeling of belonging, and it's time for you to create your community, build your A-team that's just around you. And it doesn't have to be loads of people, and it doesn't have to be people who are really physically there. If you can have a friend or a colleague or a neighbour who you connect with, who you trust, then that is good to have that physical presence. But there are lots of opportunities online. There are lots of communities, there are networks, there are different groups that you may resonate with, and you could start with that if you don't feel so comfortable about building a network of connections that are going to support you as you start this next chapter where you are repairing the neglect you experienced. And my final tip of today is to practice self-care. If you already do, then up it. If you don't, then it's time to start. And again, start in a very small way if this feels unfamiliar or uncomfortable to you. But start setting aside even just 10 minutes a day where you do something just for you. It may be sitting down and reading, maybe catching 10 minutes of your favourite show or podcast, maybe just lingering in the shower with a nice fragrant set of toiletries that you've put aside for yourself. It doesn't have to be big, though if you have the time and the budget, then go for it. Just start to take care of yourself, to notice your needs, notice when you're tired and need an early night, and get into the habit of asking people for help, which can be difficult if you're not used to it. But by doing all of these things, you are starting to rebuild that sense of worth from the inside, and this is going to have a positive impact on how you lead your team, how you lead your business, and how you can create growth, first and foremost for yourself because you deserve it, and secondly for your business or your organisation. I'd love to hear how you get on putting any of these tips into practice, and if anything that I've said today resonates with you. If you'd like to explore what working with me one-to-one could look like, there are links below so you can find out more about that and book in a free 30-minute consultation. Until next time, take really good care. Bye for now.